Okay, so let's talk about the relationship between arguments and decision making. So making a decision is sort of like arguing with yourself. You're trying to figure out what to do, what the right course of action is, and you're giving yourself reasons for or against that course of action. At least ideally, that's what deliberation would involve. It's sitting back, taking time, thinking through reasons for or against some particular course of action, evaluating the quote-unquote arguments for a particular course of action, and then picking the one that has the best arguments supporting it. And, of course, that's a very abstract way of talking about a very normal process of making decisions, etc., and, very fluid and informal way of making decisions. But notice that if you're faced with a really important decision and you deliberately slow yourself down, you recognize, maybe for some moral reason, let's say that the decision is going to affect other people. Let's say you're in a position of power over others, where you have to decide, for example, whether you should vaccinate your children against an illness, or whether you should buy a car seat, or whether you should put a fence around your backyard and to keep out the neighbor kids from your swimming pool or something like that. In each case there, if you might, presumably if you're a good person, you'll pause and think carefully about what's involved in a decision like that, and you'll look for the best possible reasons either for or against some course of action. So decision-making involves reasoning, it involves deliberation, and it involves considering carefully why one ought to do one thing or another. So arguments are often have this component of, providing justification. And just justification means answering why questions, right? Giving good reasons involves, being able to give good answers to why questions. Like, why should I do that? Well, if you can give some good chain of reasons or good arguments, then you've justified your course of action or your contention, etc. Making good decisions requires us to, or involves doing our best to reason well. There's a moral component to this. So if you are a good person, then you'll do your best to make good decisions. And good decisions require careful consideration of evidence and careful consideration of the inferences involved in the sequence of sentences that justify the course of action. So careful deliberation is critical to good decision making. And so what you're going to be faced with as a decision maker is considering arguments for or against some course of action. So the question is, how do you determine which arguments are good or bad? And clearly the first step in reasoning well, which is critical to being a good decision maker, is learning how to judge the quality of arguments. And we've already seen that the two principal criteria by which we're going to evaluate arguments are the two principal virtues according to which we're going to evaluate arguments are truth and formal correctness. So formal correctness, we'll also call that validity of arguments. These two will be the key properties, the key virtues that we'll be looking at. So if you were let's say you were taking a rhetoric course, you might look at other properties, other virtues of an argument. So for example, the principal property of an argument, the principal virtue of an argument that you'd study in a rhetoric course would be the persuasiveness of an argument. So persuasiveness is a virtue of an argument. Whether an argument is persuasive or not is, you can judge whether an argument is persuasive or not. And that would be, let's say we're an advertising executive, then presumably the principal virtue that you'd be interested in as an advertising executive is the persuasiveness of the argument, not the truth and not the validity or formal correctness of the argument. Likewise, with political propaganda. Politicians are interested, presumably, in results, in practical actions. So the outcomes they're looking for would depend on the persuasiveness of the arguments they're giving, not the truth of the arguments or the formal correctness of the argument. So we're not politicians and we're not advertising executives. We're not in the business of manipulating other people. We're interested primarily in determining what the best course of action is. Or let's say, if we're interested in scientific inquiry or scholarly inquiry, what the truth is. We don't care about persuading people. It's often the case that persuasive arguments are persuasive, maybe often in spite of being false and being formally invalid. Okay, so we've got to distinguish those different kinds of virtues that arguments have. We, in this class, don't care about persuasiveness. If you want to be an advertising executive or an attorney or a politician, then you can take a rhetoric class. We're not interested in that in this class. Okay, so how do we evaluate then the truth of premises and the correctness of inferences? Well, determining the truth of premises is, generally speaking, best left to scientific inquiry. So there are aspects of truth that logic can get at, and truth is a deep and interesting philosophical question. But for the most part, if we're trying to determine whether it's true that there are 100,000 people in Lawrence, Kansas, we're going to leave that task to the empirical scientist, to the demographer, or to the person running the census, etc. Okay, so that's not the job of a logician, to determine the truth of whether or not, there are 100,000 people in Lawrence. The primary task of the logician and the philosopher is the determination of the correctness of the inference, is the formal character of the argument. And that's what we're going to be focused on. So notice that when we're making complex decisions, we often jump right into a kind of formalizations. We talked earlier about determining pros and cons for particular courses of action. Well, notice that that's already a kind of formal move. So you've probably seen sometimes when people have to make a difficult decision, they'll write 2 columns on a piece of paper and they'll say, well, here's why I'm going to get married, and here's why I shouldn't get married, here's why I should get married, etc., etc. And they'll write pros and cons on that sheet of paper. Notice that that's already, you're beginning to articulate and beginning to figure out and beginning to deliberate carefully by doing that. So this is something we do naturally. Now, we don't do it very well. That's a very simple way of approaching formalization. But just to give you a sense for the additional power of formalization, that's sort of where we're headed. Okay, so we're going to see, and in the text you'll see some examples of longer arguments and how we begin to unpack those arguments, how we begin to identify their parts, identify what the assumptions are, identify the conclusion, and track the inferences. We're doing that a little bit in the text. We're not going to do that in these videos, but we will talk a little bit about how we can begin to see the role of formal reasoning in decision making. So in addition to the kinds of formal virtues or vices that we'll be looking at as we study our arguments, we're going to spend some time talking about evidence and how we determine whether a source of evidence is reliable or not, and that bears on the question of the truthfulness of the premises. So as we begin evaluating arguments, the examples that we look at in the text are longer arguments where we're looking at, okay, well, what are the premises? What are the basic assumptions? What are the inferences? What are the moves involved? And then finally, what's the conclusion or what's the main contention? As we probe the arguments, we can find fault in either the premises, the truth of the premises, or in the quality of the moves and the inferences. So if, for example, the premises are true and the inferences are formally valid or formally correct, if the inferences are formally correct, the premises are true, then we're compelled to accept the conclusion. But it might be the case that the premises are false, in which case we would be entitled to reject the conclusion and reject the argument. So we'll be studying these additional properties of arguments as a whole, soundness and validity, in later classes, in later videos. But for now, we could say that validity means formal correctness and sound of an argument, and soundness means formal correctness of the argument plus truth of the premises. So those are two distinguishable components. So you can have a perfectly formally correct argument with faulty premises or faulty assumptions. So clearly, responsible decision-making involves analyzing carefully what the sources of your evidence are, the truth or falsity of your premises, etc., in addition to straightforward considerations of validity. Okay, so let's think about a case of, let's say, a bad argument. So let's look at a bad argument, and this bad argument might inform a bad piece of decision making. So here's a situation. So you can imagine this guy Sam, and Sam knows, and here knows, we'll assume that he knows and he's true. It's true, and he's justified in believing. And let's say he has a reliable source or method for deriving beliefs. That's good enough for now for a characterization of knowing. So Sam knows that, what does he know? Whenever Carla stays up late at night, she's tired the next day. Okay? So what does he know? He knows, this is going to be called a conditional statement. So if she stays up late, then she's tired the next day. Okay, we're already into the business of understanding the relationships between parts of sentences, and we'll study this in great detail as we go forward. But for now, we'll call this is a conditional. It's something like, if it's true, then it's something like a law. Okay, all right. That whenever she stays up late, she's tired the next day. And then what happens? Well, he sees that Carla is tired this morning. Okay, so this is, his eyes provide him with this evidence. So this is also a premise, as we'll see. So the first premise he has is the conditional, that if she stays up late, she'll be tired the next day. The second premise is Carla is tired this morning. And then what he concludes, his conclusion, is that she stayed up late the previous night. Okay, so he makes that move. And then he goes ahead and he acts, and he says, he gives her an unwanted piece of advice. He says, you know, you ought to go to bed earlier in the future. So his action of giving her that piece of advice is informed by his piece of reasoning. Okay. Trouble with this is it's a faulty piece of reasoning. So this is a classic example of a flawed piece of reasoning. And she reveals this immediately when she says to him, you know, I didn't stay up late last night. I got up very early this morning to do my logic homework. So she provided in her response, once she gives her response, we can see, or we can begin to see, that there's something wrong with his pattern of reasoning, his previous pattern of reasoning. What she gives here is what we call a counterexample to his argument. So it's a counterexample to the argument. Now, what exactly is wrong with his argument? Well, we'll see now in a second. But for now, we can say, okay, well, clearly, it's not always going to be the case that when she's tired, it means that she stayed up the previous night. But John, you told us a second ago that he knew that there was a law-like relationship between her staying up the previous night and her being tired the next day. And yes, we say he knew that, and he does know that. He knows that whenever she stays up late, she's tired the next day. Then presumably, if she's tired the next day, she stayed up late. No, it doesn't work like that, right? Counterexample given is, well, I actually got up early this morning, and that's why I was tired, why I am tired today. Maybe she ran a marathon yesterday, and that's why she's tired the next day. Maybe she stayed up all night playing video games, etc., etc. Okay, so I didn't stay up last night. I got up early this morning, and I did my logic homework. That's the counterexample to his reasoning. Okay. So let's look at the pattern of argument again. So Sam knows that whenever she stays up late at night, she's tired the next day. He sees that she's tired this morning. Those are premises. Or assumptions. And he takes those to be true. And in fact, they are true. Then his conclusion is that she stayed up late the previous night. And this is where his trouble lies. So the inference is a bad inference, and we'll explain why in a second. I guess you've already seen why. As we know, she said in our previous case, hey, look, I actually got up to do my logic homework. But notice, even if she did stay up late the previous night, she's still entitled to say to him, hey, you don't know for sure that I stayed up late last night. For all you know, I could have run a marathon yesterday. And here she's pointing out precisely what the failure is in his reasoning. You don't know for sure that I stayed up last night. For all you know, I could have run a marathon yesterday. Okay, so notice already built into this we have, for all you know, what we have here is she's saying it's compatible with your premises. It's compatible with these two premises that the conclusion is false. Okay? So it's compatible with, for all you know, and you just know these two premises, I might have run a marathon yesterday. Okay? And I might have run a marathon as the denial of you stayed up late the previous night. Okay? So the counterexample here works by showing that the negation, or the denial, we'll say, the denial of the conclusion is compatible with the premises. And that's what she's doing here. It might be the case that she actually did stay up late last night. But she says, for all you know, I could have run a marathon yesterday. Okay? And so this is the way counterexamples work to show that there are invalid arguments. We're showing that the denial of the conclusion is compatible with the truth of the premises. If it's a good argument, then it'll never be the case that the conclusion is false while the premises are true. If it's a bad argument, then you can show that there are counterexamples. You can show cases where the denial of the conclusion is compatible with the truth of the premises. So just to wrap it up, let's take a look at the form Right. So the problem with Sam's reasoning is the form that it takes and not the truth or falsity of the sentences themselves. So let's contrast that with a good pattern of reasoning. So we'll look at the two patterns of reasoning, Sam's and modus ponens. So Sam's is a bad one, modus ponens is a good one. So here's a good pattern of reasoning. Again, take a look at this. Whenever Carla stays up late at night, she's tired the next day. So there's our conditional. Our second premise, these two things are premises. Our second premise, Carla stays up late at night. And here's our conclusion. Therefore, Carla is tired the next day. Okay. So this pattern of argument, if A then B, A concluding B, perfect. That's formally correct. Let's compare that with what Sam was doing. Here's our good one. If A then B, A, therefore B. Here's our bad one, affirming the consequent. It's called a fallacy. It's one of our fallacies, and we'll talk about that in a second. If A then B, B, therefore A. Okay, so that's a fallacious pattern of reasoning. So now why is that? Because there are counterexamples. There are no counterexamples to modus ponens. There are counterexamples to this inference. So if let's say, for example, if I run a marathon, then I'll be tired. I'm tired, therefore I ran a marathon. Obviously, you see that that's faulty, right? It's highly unlikely that I ran a marathon. And most of the time when I'm tired, it's not because I ran marathons. So there are counterexamples. So if I run a marathon, then I'll be tired. I'm tired, therefore I ran a marathon. No, actually, I just stayed up all night playing video games.